too. Good morning. Welcome to Contemporary Issues class. Glad to have you all here today and on Zoom. And we were just talking here. Some of us were up till 12:30 last night watching a certain college football game. It was very exciting. You too, Doug. I see you shaking your head there. Yes, wasn't that exciting? CU football game. So much going. Although one person I talked to this morning said, I don't like Deion Sanders because he's arrogant and he should not be doing that kind of example for college young people. And I thought that was a different perspective. Yeah.
What do you think, though, Steve, that his relationship with his son, so how he was so fatherly and compassionate? I thought he was a good role model.
An exciting game, yes. All of
Black
that,
families in particular.
all of that together.
Who won?
Who- The CU Boulder team won in the last seconds.
Oh.
Yeah,
Yes, very
Sorry,
interesting.
I didn't see it.
overtime, yeah,
Overtime.
yeah, double overtime.
But today we're not really talking football. I'm sorry, I started it. That's right. Today we're talking Russia, a bigger topic, but equally important to football or more. Let's say that.
Yes.
And we are pleased that Ron is going to tell us today a little about the history of Russia and why it came to the point that it is today in Ukraine and threatening other neighbors. So it should be quite interesting. Our usual announcements. Zoomers, please mute yourself on the lower left corner of your screen when you're not talking, and we are recording this for future playback. And any other announcements? Things, church meeting today, you all probably know State of the Church review in Fellowship Hall by Rev Mark, all the different ministries and categories and financials, and should be interesting to see how St. Andrew is doing. And then tomorrow night there is a Zoom class with Rev Mark reviewing his new book that we did. Was it last week we did? Yeah. So if you have questions, it should be quite interesting.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. Okay. Later chapters of yes. So I want to share that. You can sign up on the St. Andrew website to get the Zoom link for that, or I will send it to you.
Are you gonna send it again?
I will send it to you again too. Yes, yes, thank you, Wanda. Okay. All right, any other thoughts?
Steve, I just
Yes.
lost Jamie in the changing cycle of who's speaking. When is Jamie coming, or have I missed her?
Don't know. Yeah, she's asked about Jamie Martin, our director of outreach, was supposed to come speak to us twice, but she's canceled a couple times because her daughter is in championship soccer tournaments. And that is important to support, of course. So don't know yet. We'll get her rescheduled. But yes, absolutely. Thank you, Linda. Okay, with that, Ron, thank you for this topic.
Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. If you're my age, as a kid, you probably remember some things in your early childhood where you learned right away there was such a thing as a Red Scare and the Soviet Union being an adversary. I remember in sixth grade, a kid that turned out later to be co-valedictorian in my high school, in front of our sixth grade class, we each had to give a presentation. And he wrote a little personal story, and it was about a girl in West Berlin or East Berlin that was trying to get over to West Berlin. And she had gotten her father in trouble by revealing to the authorities there in East Berlin that her father was not a fan of the Soviet system. And you all remember how many people got killed going over the wall in West Berlin. Just the horror of it.
Dead in red.
Yeah, thinking that now we complain about immigrants coming into our country and stopping immigrants from coming in, and they were murdering people right and left trying to get out. So what a day it was. I'm always drawing from movies and things like that. How many here saw the movie Patton? with George C. Scott. And remember when when the US and the Russian forces meet, and Patton meets the Russian general there at the little dinner party, and he tells the translator, translate what I said exactly. Remember that moment?
Remember.
Yeah, that was a magic one. I also remember as a kid in my backyard about 1963, 62, the Cuban Missile Crisis. My father said, wow, look at all these Air Force planes going over our house. And there were two major Air Force bases north of Cincinnati, Wright-Patterson, and then there was one in Wilmington, Ohio that they closed. But you could tell something was going on. There were all these military jets and cargo planes heading south to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I also talked with a friend who's in the Highlands Ranch concert band with me, and he said he was in a World War II era submarine, and they were told to head for the Caribbean to be ready for. And how many saw the movie 13 Days? That's another movie I'll push. Highly recommend it. It deals with the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis where things were tottering on the edge. So that's another excellent movie to watch. Okay, so let's get, I gotta add one more. I love James Bond movie. For those that, we hear about the KGB and what nasty rascals they are, and they are. I mean, they've gone and put deadly poisons, polonium and other things. They went into Great Britain and killed a dissident there. Remember that?
Yeah.
Created a major crisis with the British government because they went into Britain and put a radioactive poison into the food of one dissident and his daughter, and they barely survived. So they're known for being really dirty, nasty. And so if you want to have a good movie that has a good bit of truth behind it, of course, James Bond is fiction, I recommend The Living Daylights. It's a great Bond movie. And so with that,
Ron, what was the name again?
The Living Daylights. Timothy Dalton did a couple Bond movies. I guarantee you, and Cynthia Norman would like to watch it too. And you'll see why after if you watch it. Bond and
Cello player.
a cello going down this mountainside riding a cello case. And the KGB get,
Cello up.
yeah. So, okay, but this movie has a tremendous amount of KGB involvement, and they end up in a missile base in Afghanistan, or an air base in Afghanistan where the Russians have invaded. So it's a gripping and very entertaining movie. Okay, one of the major resources we use for today's presentation is Tim Snyder. He's a professor at Yale University, and he's written the book, The Road to Unfreedom, and Russia, Europe, and America. He also has quite a bit of presence on the internet and YouTube. So he's a good person to listen to, particularly relative to the Ukrainian war and the conflict with Russia. And he's particularly good at getting into the Russian mind. What are they thinking? What makes them this way? And that's kind of the lesson we're looking at today. What made the Russian society, what's built, what's molded them into this kind of people that they are, and trying to understand it a little better. Next slide.
Ron, there's
Yep.
another good movie called The Last Tsars. Mary and I just finished.
The less what?
Tsars of Russia,
Oh,
where they killed and murdered the royal family.
okay,
Another mindset.
okay, okay.
What's the name of it?
All right.
Last Tsars.
Okay. Well, we open with a saying, when life opens a window, a Russian dissident is sure to fall out. Next one. Again, this is an interview with Tim Snyder on Frontline. It's called Putin and the Presidents, but I just wanted to quote the line and out of there. He said, they have chosen to use us as their foreign enemy of agent. It's convenient politically for them to have built the United States and made it a political enemy. Sure. Just like Kim Jong-un has done it particularly so. he's kind of built his regime around hating the West and hating the United States. Some other good books, book called The Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. That's also a book by Tim Snyder. And a good book on post-war, History of Europe Since 45 by Tony Junt. Okay, next one. Opening Thoughts to Ponder. Well, there's another Bond movie, Rush with Love. But here are some faulty assumptions that we can make. Capitalism is unalterable and democracy inevitable. Democracy, yes, has made tremendous progress in the world, but it's not inalterable. It's not unstoppable. There are forces that are trying to subvert it, kill it, and totalitarianism is not dead. Even the floods in Libya this week we heard about. Libya is basically divided into two warring camps. It's not a real active military conflict, but the nation is, for all practical purposes, broken into two Cold War segments. Democracy and educated Western democracies, especially in the United States, is totally secure. No way, baby. I recommend Adam Schiff's book, Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. Propaganda and lies cannot prevail in our country.
Oh, my gosh.
That's not true. Goodness and mercy will always prevail. Well, the 23rd Psalm kind of implies that, but doesn't always happen in this world. Established history cannot be reframed. If you look at particularly guys like Putin and many totalitarian kind of leaders, they can definitely do a beautiful job of reframing history presented.
Ministry of Truth.
Another faulty assumption, the Russian Federation is no longer a threat to Western democracy. Boy, that's not true. Next one. So let's go back. One of the things that Putin has done very recently in Russian education, he's told that their elementary schools and the junior high school levels in particular, they want them to push more with pledges of allegiance and those kind of things to open classes, giving the kids more indoctrination. They don't say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and all this, but they do go through now some, I call them some semi-brainwashing, Putinistic ceremonies in a lot of their classes. One of the things that Putin would like to wash out of the Russian history book is the fact that Stalin and Hitler had signed a pact together, and they were together, gangsters going out there on a world stage, trying to envelop and take over the world, particularly massive parts of Europe. There's a book called The Katyn Massacre, and this happened in April of 1940. Now remember, in September 39, we know Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland. Actually, Czechoslovakia before that. But they both invaded Poland. The Russians went in from one side, the Germans went in from another. Poland was one of the most brutalized countries in World War II. A high double-digit percentage of Polish civilians lost their lives in the World War II era. But the Russians went in on one side, and in April 1940, the Soviet secret police murdered almost 22,000 Polish prisoners. Particularly, they went for their officer corps. They literally identified every Polish army or military force person they could find who was of the rank of first lieutenant and up, and even some lower than that, and literally took them out to about 5 killing sites and killed almost 22,000 of them. Their objective is, if we kill the educated male leadership, we will quell the ability of this nation to resist us. And so this massacre at Caton Forest is something else. Of course, we know that Hitler backstabbed his fellow gangster Stalin and attacked him. But don't for a minute think that the two of them weren't both gangsters. And Putin would like to portray Russia now as a champion who stopped Nazism and stopped this, but he was a co-gangster. The only reason he went against Germany was because Germany backstabbed him. So, and they have found out they found documents that came out in 1991. Historians got a hold of some of the Stalinistic documents, which were and still are, to a great extent, repressed and buried. The Soviets don't want their citizens to see them. But the massacre that happened of those Polish people was a deliberate policy of Stalin. And there was also, in April of 2010, they tried to have a memorial service. The Russians finally said, okay, let's have a memorial service for the people that were killed in this Caton massacre. And a whole bunch of Polish officials were killed in a plane crash coming into Russia. And the cause of that plane crash did and still causes political turmoil.
Like the one last week with
Yep,
the dissident that died in a plane crash.
right. Okay, next one.
Convenient.
Okay, so some Russian history. It's replete with violence, revolution, and war with countries. 1902, the Russians essentially conquered Finland, and the governor of Finland, Governor General of Finland, 1902, was given power to dismiss the opponents of Russification from the Finnish government. So Russia had taken over Finland in 1902. 1904, the Russia-Japanese War, where the Russian navies got their butts kicked at Port Arthur by the Japanese torpedo attack. And the Russians were trying to expand southward into the areas of the Korean Peninsula and come down from Manchuria. And they were stopped by the Japanese. The Japanese still feel darn good about how they stopped the Russian invasion. And that was a great military victory for the Japanese forces. 1905, January, there was a strike at the Pudilov Works in St. Petersburg. And on that bloody Sunday, 1905 in January, in that strike and the rebellion, not a rebellion, but it was kind of a mini riot, rebellion in the street. They called in the Imperial Guards. 200 were killed and 800 wounded. That is what you call. They fired on a peaceful demonstration led by a priest named Georgy Gapone. And then in 1905, there was mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, and a small revolution trying to overthrow the Tsar happened then, and that was repressed. Next slide. Okay, so we move into the 1910s era, and we need to know the key words here: the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Menshevik comes from the word minority in Russian, Bolshevik from majority. The Bolsheviks, they're the really bad guys, believe in radical and elitist revolution, where the Mensheviks supported a more progressive change, a non-violent progressive change in collaboration with the middle class and the bourgeoisie. So the Mensheviks were pretty good. I mean, they're not the ideal democracy or anything like that, but compared to the Bolsheviks, they're angelic compared to the Bolsheviks. So there were the Mensheviks who wished for an inclusive party and a social democracy. Yes, they did have a heavy dose of socialism, but they were not violent in trying to repress, kill, and wipe out people. Whereas the Bolsheviks wanted an exclusive party and a communist dictatorship. And the Bolsheviks were led by Lenin. And the Mensheviks came to argue for predominantly legal methods and trade union work, while the Bolsheviks favored armed violence. So Mensheviks pretty good, Bolsheviks downright horrible.
Is that based on the word mensch, which is a Jewish Yiddish word? I wonder.
I would have to research that. I'm not sure.
Sounds like it.
Okay. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1922, the Mensheviks tried to form a legal opposition, but they were crushed. Next slide. Okay. As we move through the 1912s, 1912, there was the Lena Goldfields massacre. 150 miners killed when strikers were fired at. Pressure came up on the Tsar. It was building, and he abdicated February of 1917. And the Bolshevik leader Lenin returned from exile and started rebuilding. Notice there, in 1918, the Red Army captured Kiev. Yes, that's the Kiev now we hear about that's part of Ukraine, and started mass conscription of young men to go into the military in Moscow and Petrograd. Next slide. And this is the Lenin issued the order to kill the Romanovs. Yes, there is a movie on it. I'm glad somebody brought that up in a book. They were taken out. It said his wife, their 5 children were shot and bayoneted to death by Bolshevik revolutionaries that night. And they were stripped, buried, shot up, and mutilated with hand grenades that they threw in the pit to blow the bodies to pieces. And this occurrence came to life or was revealed in about 1979. There was an amateur sleuth, a Dick Tracy kind of guy in the Soviet Union by the name of Alexander Abadonin, who discovered the burial site, and he finally they did DNA evidence and proved, yes, the Romanov family had been killed in that little forest clearing that horrible night and blown to bits. Okay, so the Bolsheviks set the stage for violence, killing, and a general character of the Russian people. Okay. All right. 1918. The Moldavian Democratic Republic declared independence from Russia. In March of 1918, the Soviets signed the treaty bailing out of World War I and relinquishing Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. So again, the Soviet peasant public was so sick of World War I that the Tsar just couldn't keep his people together, and they bailed out of the war. 1918, there was Lenin was shot twice after giving a speech. So he was an assassination target, but he survived, unfortunately. Then the Red Terror started in 1918. Somebody named Izvestia called on the Russian people to crush counter-revolution with mass terror. So here, the Bolsheviks said, you try to stop us and we're going to wipe out the opposition, the Mensheviks. We're going to set in this program of terror and crush our enemies. 1918, the Russian army invades Estonia. 1920, Battle of Warsaw, that's Poland. The Red Army is stopped by the Poles. But you see the conquest and the conquer, where Russia has continually attacked Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Finland. 1924, Lenin dies, and others rise to take over the Communist Party. But one thing's for sure, in 1924, murders of opponents becomes the norm. So it became a This is the way the Russians started operating in 1924. You oppose the Communist Party, you oppose the Bolsheviks, you get killed. There'll be no counter choice. 1930 in April, the Gulag is officially established. Does anybody know what the Gulag is?
Prison?
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, they set up a mass network of prisons all over the Soviet Union, a lot of them in Siberia. And they sent people by the millions, not thousands, millions to these gulags to die in hard labor, near starvation, whatever. Next slide. Okay, so here I call this slide Stalin and the Full Red Terror release. 1936 to 1938, many Moscow trials were held where anti-Soviet elements, often dozens of people at a time, are sentenced to death, and many without trial disappear into the Gulag. And then there's the pact between Russia and Germany, and then the Red Army invaded Poland, and many Polish areas were annexed by the Soviet Union. Gee, where's history repeated itself?
They will give up on
Soviets taking an area of Poland, annexing it, and we see the Soviet Union doing that today now with Crimea, areas of Ukraine, and who knows what else they have in their
Ron,
mind.
but
Yeah.
one slide back, you were talking about, World War One. They pulled out of World War One and relinquished these countries.
But then they went back.
And
Yeah,
changed
yeah.
their mind
Yeah,
and took them back.
in a way, it's history repeating itself now, because as the Soviet Union broke up just several decades ago, but in 1980s, 1990-ish, Soviet Union's now trying to wrap its arms and re-envelop many of the states and areas that broke away from it. Okay. There's our back one. Couple nasties. That's Molotov. What's Molotov known for? Yeah, the firebomb with a beer bottle, gasoline. And there's a picture of a couple starving Polish kids that had been put into the Gulag. And Molotov played a key role in organizing the Gulag. Also, he authorized the Soviet invasion of Poland or Finland in 1939. If you read history, Finland made a valiant defense against the Russian invasion with their ski troops. Okay, next one. Stalinism, cold-blooded killers, breaking rocks with handmade tools. Everything was done by hand. Malnutrition, killing people by the thousands as they were worked. The one guy said in the book, we picked up a wooden towel, a cup of cold, and a cup of hot water, evil smelling soap. They were allowed a bath once a week with a couple cups of water, foul smelling soap. It was just horror camps, concentration camps. Next one. Of course, Stalin was one of the worst killers in history. There is a book, there's several books by Anne Applebaum. That's a name to know. But she wrote a book called Red Famine, dealing with the crushing of Ukraine. And Stalin launched a program of agricultural collectivism, forcing millions of peasants off their lands onto collective farms. He produced a catastrophic famine, worst in European history, with at least 5 million people dying of starvation between 31 and 33. 3 million of those were Ukrainian. So Stalin starved at least 3 million Ukrainians to death with his imposed. So the Soviet Union most certainly has a history of abusing Ukraine and killing its people. There's a term called Holodomor, death by hunger in Ukrainian, refers to the starvation of millions of Ukrainians. And of course, there was the assault by the Communist Party and Soviet state on the Ukrainian peasantry. Alice and I are going in December to the Boulder Dinner Theater to see Fiddler on the Roof. And that, of course, the setting of that is, it's an imaginary story, but it's based on many true facts where the Soviet government did incredibly suppress, kill, and persecute Jewish people. Yeah. There were reports of famine in this 1930s thing all across USSR, from the Volga to Caucasians, Kazakhstan. Famine wiped out more than half of the populations in some areas. So again, and yet that last bullet, amazingly, they've taken some public opinion polls in Russia, and Stalin still gets pretty good numbers there in terms of, oh, he was a good leader, strong leader, you know, like he killed people by the millions, one of the worst demagogues in world history, and yet people seem to have we love strong leaders, we don't care what they do, just, you know, where does that happen today? Yeah. Next one. Okay. The Leningrad Horror. This, of course, refers to World War II, as Russia fought the German forces. There's a book called 900 Days, The Siege of Leningrad. And the number of people killed around the Leningrad area, it said nearly 3 million people endured the siege of Leningrad, and about half of them died. So that's 1.5 million Russians killed in the siege of Leningrad. It does show, I think, in the total World War II total of Russians killed in World War II, civilians mostly, is like 20 million. So it's impacted the Russian mentality.
Yeah.
They took,
Civilians,
okay,
4 million military.
okay, they lost so many that they just become that. Not only did they lose all these people in World War II, but Stalin's killings, they just got used to mass millions of deaths being put out there, and kind of, you know, getting numb to it.
Just another day.
And we see some of that today in Putin's attitudes toward, you know, let's start a war, let's kill, you know, thousands of Ukrainians and Russian soldiers, and it obviously doesn't bother him.
Pat and I were in Russia about 15 years ago, I can't remember when. But at that time, there was still a class of citizen that they called the babushka. And the babushka were old women. And there were lots of them. Because they're widows from World War II and after that, of all of the men that were killed during World War II. Large number.
And the way they used their soldiers, they would often in World War II, they would have a sergeant with a machine gun say, okay, everybody charge. And it would be a suicidal like charge. And anybody that didn't charge would get shot in the back by their own sergeant, forcing the peasant army forward. And that's one of the reasons they took so many casualties. Okay, next one. Of course, when the Soviets captured Germans, they did some numbers. West Germany did a study, and they figure about 3 million German military personnel were taken prisoner by the Russians, and that over 1 million of them died in captivity. So Russia pretty much tried to kill as many of the Russian prisoners as they could by starvation, direct murder. I saw another book that said a majority of German POWs captured by the Soviets were killed. But that's a graph showing total deaths by nation in World War II. And we see the Soviet Union, China, and Poland being way out there in front in terms of sheer numbers of deaths. Next one. Okay, Right after World War II, of course, the commie bully gets unleashed, the Berlin airlift. And next slide. There's the most notorious traitor there at Los Alamos that passed most of the nuclear secrets into the hands of the Soviets, and they estimate he pushed the Soviet Union several years ahead in terms of when they got the bomb. Next slide. 1950s. Does anyone remember Nikita Khrushchev appearing on TV, banging his
Shoes.
and there was a 3-word phrase, we will, or 4-word, we will bury you. Yeah. And the reason he's having such a hissy fit here is that, let's see, a delegate from the Philippines got up in front of the United Nations in 1960 and said that Eastern Europe had become deprived of political and civil rights, and the Soviets were a bunch of, just bully controllers of Eastern Europe. He was telling the truth, and Nikita threw his hissy fit in response to that proclamation.
Why the shoe? What's the shoe represent?
Oh, he's holding a shoe.
He didn't have
Yeah.
anything to bang it on.
Yeah.
Something, he didn't have a gavel.
Okay, I see.
Okay, next one. Okay, so there, again, Anne Applebaum, the author, she's got several good books. Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956. And I mentioned in a prior lesson, there's a memorial to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 down here in Denver, in a couple places actually. But we can see the extent of the Red Iron Curtain, how it certainly enveloped Ukraine and Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, half of Germany. Yeah, bad news. Next one. There's Ukraine, and we see how Ukraine is a very large country. It's a major block of territory. So if Russia completely envelops all of Ukraine, it looks like they will certainly not be able to get the whole of the country, although they've nailed 20% of it on the eastern side. But you see where Ukraine is geographically important part of control of Europe. Next slide. The Iron Curtain did get opposition. That's a picture there in the bottom left of the Solidarity movement in the country of Poland. It was one of the first countries to really kick back and resist the Soviets. Next one. 1956, Budapest. Interestingly, the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, that was the Hungarian uprising, lasted about 12 days before it was completely crushed by Soviet tanks. What people don't know is how many were killed. Thousands were killed and wounded, and nearly 250,000 Hungarians fled the country. So the Soviet hammer is cruel, vicious, and they certainly showed it in 1956 and in several other places in Europe in the 50s and 60s. Next slide.
So do you think Putin's thinking that they could go into Ukraine and do the same thing that happened here in Hungary? Do you think it was gonna be that easy?
His intent there, they got pretty close to the suburbs of Kiev.
Yeah,
He would have taken over all of Ukraine, had the Ukrainian people not fought back bravely and courageously. There was about a 10-day window there where, yeah,
We're on time check, just to check 11 and 12.
right. We'll wrap her up here. We got to remember the crushing of Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Soviet leaders got very nervous about Dubček putting in some fairly democratic positions, and the Soviets sent their tanks into Czechoslovakia in 1968. Next one. They crushed that. They sent 200,000 to 600,000 Warsaw Pact troops into Czechoslovakia, flew Dubček to Moscow and forced him to repeal the reforms. Next slide. And then, of course, the Polish crisis, 1980 to 1981, where the solidarity movement helped break Poland free, eventually, of Soviet control. Next one. And then, of course, the Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 89. That's a story in itself. And again, fiction, yeah, but based on a lot of, if you watch the Bond movie, you'll enjoy it. So you'll learn history and have some fun too. But, okay, The Living Daylights, that's the James Bond movie. And a good bit of that occurs. There's Timothy Dalton and the female heroine at an air base in Afghanistan. Exciting movie. All right. In that Afghan conquest, they estimate somewhere between 6.5% to 11.5% of Afghanistan's population was killed.
Wow.
So that's a lot of deaths. Next one. Of course, everybody, I don't know who remembers, were a Korean air flight that departed from the United States, drifted into the Soviet airspace in 1983, and the Soviets shot it down, killing close to 300 people.
Yeah.
Again, it just shows the brutality of even the Russian military, and they're finding right now, as the Russian army is going into Ukraine, they've found that places where they've set up torture centers, done some horrible war crimes against Polish civilians and military people. It just seems to be an inbreeding violence and brutality in much of the Russian population. Okay. Russia, of course, underwent a tremendous transformation in the 80s. 1991, next slide. Turmoil, next slide. And this, okay, 31, number 31. This shows December of 1991, in a period of 2 years, the Soviet Union broke into all these pieces, these 15 pieces. But it's kind of reconstituted itself.
Putin's trying to put it back together.
Yep, next slide. Remember the Olympics in 2014, the Russians hosted the Winter Olympics, and they had that Misha bear, big teddy bear floating over it, like, oh, we're these lovely, kind Russian people, and we we're Big Bird and Kermit the Frog, and we're kind of nice, kind people. Yeah. Of course, it found that they were cheating like heck with doping up their athletes like crazy. Okay, let's talk about those nasty Russians. And then, of course, here's an incident I consider one of the most abhorrent things that ever happened in U.S. history, where Trump went up and declared that Putin assured him that they hadn't interfered in our election, and that Trump said he believed Putin and not our security services. So let's get the discussion going here. Obviously, I'm not going to win any awards from the Kremlin today.
You know, the great paradox with the Russians, the phrase, the means justify the ends. The means justify the ends. So you have doping scandals in the Olympics, the Russians in tennis. But you also have some of the finest art, literature, ballet, coming out from the Russian people, the culture. Germany, in spite of all the oppressive aspects and horrendous genocides of people and such and so forth, you have that. It's a paradox, is it not? You have a bastion of culture that can't be surpassed in many ways. Then you have this other side. Two different clashing worlds that the Russian people deal with.
Okay.
Have dealt with.
Jim?
I'd like to make a comment.
Go ahead, Grant, on
Okay,
Zoom.
going back to the teens during World War I and up into World War II, I reviewed a movie, Dr. Zhivago. And Dr. Zhivago it was a romance movie, but at the same time, it showed how the people were in a turmoil and a really in flux as far as who's going to win, who was going to take over. There were the Reds and the Whites, which was in the movie, but there was all sorts of really weird stuff. And I recommend that movie for the early part of how things were going and what happened when they pulled out of World War I, and people were going back, and here they were sending troops, and all of a sudden they fought amongst themselves, and Dr. Zhivago had this place where he had to hide out, but the communists or whoever it was, I'm never really sure how many factions there were that were fighting amongst each other during the late teens and early 20s. And you, Ron, you showed a lot of that, but I never really understood exactly how many different factions there were fighting for control. Yeah, there were the Bolsheviks and the others, but
They're rather, yeah.
just making a comment that if you haven't seen that movie, I know Lola and I have seen it once or twice. I'm just throwing that in. Anyway, years ago.
Referenced Polish solidarity movement a couple of times in the 80s. Their leader, if I remember right, was named Lech Walesa or Lech Walesa. What
Yes.
happened to him? I'm just curious.
I do not know. I don't think he did. He definitely did not get violently killed or anything. I think he went on to lead a reasonable life, but I don't know the end of the story. And they say the one of the Catholic popes is from Poland, and was very much on the side of the Polish people.
Imagine
that. Jim.
European Russia, we always think of European Russia as being part of the European cultural development and everything, but that is really not true. European Russia was separated and isolated way back in the medieval times by the Mongol hordes that came up and separated European Russia. And Russia has been isolated in almost all of its development. And if you look at all of the things that they have done, it is to try to become a viable part of the rest of the world community. They have done it in absolutely ferocious and cruel ways, but their attempt is to try to become part, an integral part of the world community. They have three ports. They have the North Sea, they have the Black Sea, and they have Vladivostok. And of those three, the North Sea is almost, they can isolate them, the West can isolate them very easily, and the Black Sea can be isolated. And so Vladivostok is so far out in left field that they can't really do very much. And all of their, if you look at Ukraine, I mean, almost all of their development of their ferocity has been to try to capture ways that they can feed their people abundantly. They're starving people. They have starved since antiquity. They don't have an awful lot of arable land in Russia, and they look at Ukraine, and here's this breadbasket of the world, and they're looking at that, and they say, we'd like to have that for ourselves.
Yeah.
No question, they are cruel. Their leadership has been more than cruel is an inadequate word. But you look at their history, and their history is very predictable, and that they are trying to build some type of a consistent way of being wealthy.
Interesting. Okay.
Question on Jim's. the government's cruel, the military, but is the average Russian
Yeah.
cruel like that?
No, when Pat and I were there, we found lovely people,
Uh-huh.
over and over and over.
Okay. It reminds me kind of China also. You know, the values of the government and the military in China, it's okay to steal our business secrets and lie about things. But that's probably not the values of the average Chinese people. So how does this disconnect happen? Just makes me wonder. Ron, are there any lessons from Russian history about how the Ukraine war today might end?
Easy question.
How did they end in the past? When they would invade Poland or Ukraine, how did they end in the past?
Oh, boy. Different ways.
Yeah.
Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. Again, they got stopped by the Poles in Warsaw back there in the, was it 1915-ish or something, 17? But
Anybody want to speculate on how the Ukraine war today will end?
Well, Putin's intent, at least what commentators are saying, many of them, is that they're just gonna wear down the Western alliance. And as people bail out, and even some of our conservative people here in this country are saying, well, hey, we shouldn't be spending this kind of money supporting Ukraine. So the long game is just wear down
Yeah.
the Western alliance. Don't you get that feeling?
I
Yeah.
agree with we as Americans want things done quickly
Yeah.
and completely. And we're more easily worn down, I think.
Yeah.
We don't have the staying power, the stick to itness, that some of the more Asian cultures have.
Could I ask Rosalinda's opinion since you came from Germany? What's your opinion? No, sure I do. Okay, all right.
We're so lucky we're out where we are,
Yes,
away
we,
from all that stuff.
yes.
Basically, Americans are good people. That's why we're so easily worn down. You know, really, we don't stand up the way we should against.
Oh, my goodness, I so totally disagree with that.
Did you hear
I
that?
think the American people, our soldiers are some of the strongest.
That's
And
what
I
I'm
also
saying.
believe that we are headed for something pretty scary because of Kim Jong-un, whatever, I can't pronounce his name correctly, and Putin, and they're joining forces. And I think the Americans, our history of what we did in World War II, I think we are very strong.
I didn't say we were strong. I think we're vulnerable.
I think that's.
We're good
That's
people,
okay, we can-
but when it comes to defending our democracy against, and what's bothering me is that they're saying we're the evil forces. I just went, are you kidding me?
They reframe it, yeah.
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 We're lucky we are where we are.
It's where we are. Evil places.
What's interesting that even in the presidential election now, at least one of the Republican candidates, the young guy, Vavrick or something, is saying, no, I wouldn't put any more money into defending Ukraine. We've done enough. So, but then other Republican candidates saying we're defending democracy for the whole world here and protecting all of
right.
Europe, so.
But you know, on the other hand, when they go and defend, right, who makes money on it? The United States, the companies here in the United States.
That's
correct.
So, you know,
By
I look at
providing-
it always the power and money rather than ideology.
Follow the money.
It's always part of it, yeah, that's true.
As I read about the rise of Hitler, the 1930s, and how he systematically stepped up the persecution of the Jewish people. And we didn't do nearly as good a job in helping the Jewish people as we should have. Either providing, helping them get out.
Rosh Hashanah.
And I'm afraid as Americans, I'll have to make the criticism. Maybe I think we're too quick to go to Disneyland. So I just want to go to Las Vegas and Disneyland and enjoy movies and find restaurants and as long as the bad guys aren't coming for me, I'm not gonna do anything. And I don't wanna make any significant sacrifice to protect world democracy. And I think it's a horrible mistake if we take that position.
Aren't we a republic here?
Yes, we're a constitutional republic. Right, not
Not
a pure democracy, but sort of a democracy.
We are where we are.
That's right. We've just got a few minutes left. I want to give our Zoomers a chance to weigh in if Susan or Toby want to say anything on Ukraine or Russia. Susan, is there much, you're in Toronto, Ontario, is there much publicity on the Ukraine war in Canada?
Yeah, well, I was gonna make 2 points. So I've been to Russia 5 times. So I've been for personal reasons and professional reasons, and I took Dad once, so he's off the call now, but it was over a number of about 5-6 years. So I've seen Moscow and St. Pete. I've gotten to know the people, and my observation about how they are as people is that they can be very hard on the outside, but they're very soft on the inside. And the feeling was that the Cold War was really coming back when I was there. So there was a lot of trepidation. But in terms of Canada, yeah, we have a huge Ukrainian population up here. And so we have stepped up militarily, and we've also brought in a number of Ukrainians. I don't know, maybe 200,000 or 300,000 people so far. So it's been a lot. No, I take that back. That's by a factor of 10. I think it's been 25,000 or 30,000 people that have come in.
Wow. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any tourism there in Russia these days? Do Americans and Europeans go to Russia? Any tourism, or is it closed, totally closed off now? Everybody here is saying I wouldn't go now for anything. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, they'd arrest you for throwing a chewing gum wrapper on the sidewalk and lock you up for 10 years.
Yeah.
Yes,
You could become like the woman basketball player that was
Oh,
held
yeah.
for a year as a political prisoner. Yes.
You'd be out of your mind if you went there, right, frankly.
Well, you know, Ron, the Barbie land mentality, Ping and Putin have one major thing in common. That's why they're developing their alliance, that we're in a state of decay democracies, and we're fragile. And the more we can exacerbate that fragility, the atrophy, that will be, that's the 2-minute warning play that they certainly have at the present time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, something that I've observed is that the people of a country do not always reflect their leaders. And what the leaders are posturing on the world stage. Dale and I were in the Soviet Union in 1969, believe it or not, coming back from 2 years as early Peace Corps volunteers. And we were in Vladivostok, of all places. At that point got on a train that was supposed to be the Trans-Siberian train, and was stopped after 1 day of travel. And we were, because there were Russian troops on the parallel tracks going to the Chinese border. But when we got off that train and were put on an enormous airplane, biggest one we'd ever seen, to be flown to Moscow, there were people waiting at that train station, and they were, through the open windows of the train, begging us for books, any books in English. So at least, and you know, those were prior to electronic days, and so we all had books. And so we gave all the books we had brought with us to read on the journey through the windows out to those people begging for books in English. You know, I try to think, would we today would we evidence that same hunger for change, whether it was political or cultural, and go to that extreme, to get to the train station to see if there was something that we could get there. So anyway, the people
Very good.
don't always reflect.
Yes. We
And
need
vice
to
versa.
wrap up. Thank you for sharing, Linda. Last comment, Linda Daniel, and then we'll
Yeah,
go.
I was in Russia just before COVID, and we have to remember the size of Russia. There are many different populations represented across that country. We went east to west. And Moscow, St. Petersburg is a very different country than Siberian towns and cities. I mean, and very different cultural backgrounds.
Linda, do you think the people would speak up? Do you think there is any chance of coalescing and being?
Like in this country, people get apathetic and they are surviving in their own little world. And they don't, I mean, if you live in the east of the Urals, you have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, it would be hard to do an uprising, civilian uprising in Russia for lots of reasons. Okay, we have to close. Thank you for a good discussion. Thank you, Ron, for a good presentation.
Thank you.
Lord, we pray for the people of Russia and Ukraine and everywhere in the world. Amen. Thanks, everybody.